That's right.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is a fireside chat by the President of the United States.
My friends, this is not a fireside chat on war. It is a talk on national security. I am confident that if and when production of consumer or luxury goods in certain industries requires the use of machines and raw materials that are essential for defense purposes, then such production must yield and will gladly yield to our primary and compelling purpose. We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task.
In December 1940, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was well aware that the ongoing war in Europe might soon involve the United States, and he knew that the nation wasn't ready. It was time, he said in his famous phrase, to build the arsenal of democracy. 11 months later, the United States was at war, and the race to create munitions was on. For although Roosevelt understood that soldiers win battles, he also realized that in modern warfare, those soldiers must be equipped with the best weapons. And he knew that those weapons would come from America's industrial manpower, millions of well-trained men who would make the transition from making cars and refrigerators to making planes and tanks. There was, however, one significant problem. Over 10 million of those well-trained workers soon joined the military to fight for the president's 4 freedoms. They would be driving the tanks, not making them. The dramatic loss of manpower in the factories quickly led the Roosevelt administration to the most obvious solution. They called it Womanpower. Soon after Pearl Harbor, the need for women to join the war effort within industry and factory settings became increasingly obvious. The U.S. government was already expending $2 billion every month on the Accelerating Defense Program, and before long, 17 million new industrial jobs needed to be filled.
The production lines were expanding almost exponentially, and so the need for workers was just tremendous. And so that's where the main focus was to bring workers onto the floor, into the assembly areas. So this is where women really, where that focus was for Rosie the Riveter. I mean, even the term riveter reminds us that that's what these were. These were production and were assembly jobs that these women were recruited for, and that's where the greatest need was.
Among the first women to be hired was young Naomi Parker, who found herself working at the machine shop at the Alameda Naval Air Station in California. Some 3,000 more women soon joined her on the base, riveting, drilling, patching wings, and much more for the duration of the war. The pattern was the same across the country. Women, wrote the journalist Damon Runyon in early 1942, always do their share and a little more in war. With great respect, he referred to them as women in war, and throughout that first year at war for the nation, Americans used that phrase and similar ones to talk about the remarkable new wave of munitions workers.
The name Rosie the Riveter didn't begin right away with Pearl Harbor. You don't really see it or hear it until late 1942 when a popular song called Rosie the Riveter comes out. Now, all of that time, throughout the first year of the war for the U.S., there were lots of images of women in factories that you saw in advertisements and billboards and so on. But the song brought that name into prominence, and then increasingly the name became associated with women in the factories, whether they were riveters or not.
All the day long, whether rain or shine, she's a part of the assembly line. She's making history, working for victory. Rosie the Riveter keeps a sharp lookout for sabotage, sitting up there on the fuselage. That little frail can do more than a male can do. Rosie the Riveter. Rosie's got a...
This song by Red Evans and John Jacob Loeb made Rosie the Riveter a household name and by the spring of 1943, her name was so well known that Norman Rockwell decided to borrow it for a Saturday Evening Post cover.
Painted for the May 29, 1943 cover of the Saturday Evening Post, Rosie the Riveter depicts a strong, capable feminine figure on the home front during World War II. She represented the more than 2 million women who entered the workforce to take on jobs that had been vacated by servicemen. Rockwell's thoroughly modern Rosie not only addresses the idea that had touched all American lives, but also conveyed a can-do spirit and the emergence of women into the workforce during a time of national crisis. She is emblematic of a sea change in American culture, and the artist's depiction celebrates and even helps to invent the beginnings of gender equality.
Rockwell's model, Mary Doyle, was petite, but the artist had given her noticeable muscles to go along with the tools of her new trade.
It's interesting to note that even while having lunch, Rosie is holding a large, heavy rivet gun, which would likely have been used to build aircraft, armed forces vehicles, or munitions, as seen in the photographs from the Boeing collection. She has her foot planted firmly on Mein Kampf, Adolf Hitler's manifesto. Feminine touches such as her red lipstick and the lacy handkerchief in her pocket are reminders of her softer side. Rockwell's rendition was actually inspired by the work of art created centuries before, Michelangelo's prophet Isaiah painted on the Sistine ceiling in Rome.
The coveralls worn by Rockwell's Rosie were one of many safety garments that the real Rosies were required to wear in their new work environment.
As women came into the workforce, there were a lot of issues that were really unforeseen. And one of these that became apparent quickly was that there were accidents where women's clothing and their hair was getting caught in machinery. And so there was this immediate need to pursue these safety issues. And how do you, what actually do you wear to work? And that was not only a safety issue, but it was a concern for women as far as being fashionable. What is appropriate attire?
For some women, workplace safety concerns didn't make the prospect of taking on industrial work any easier, nor did the traditional domestic demands on women in the 1940s, which made accepting a factory job all the more daunting. Managers and recruiters were forced to introduce new programs to adapt to this new workforce.
They were very concerned about helping moms with child care, and so they worked on building daycares and ensuring that there were places for children to go and get care. There was also issues of transportation. A lot of women didn't drive in those days, or there weren't that many cars with a number of the shortages and rationing. So they developed carpools and buses and share the rides and all sorts of different transportation to help women get to work.
But as the war ground on and as more men left for the military, the need for additional workers became greater and greater. The Office of War Information, in cooperation with the War Advertising Council, then unveiled its Womanpower campaign.
The Womanpower effort was this really interesting campaign that hits high gear in 1943. So as soon as the U.S. becomes involved in the war, you start to see this exodus of men from factories. And as those factories are transitioning over to making munitions, there becomes a dire need for workers. And of course, your natural resource at that point is going to be women, who often are staying at home. But you have to convince these women who had never really thought, most of them, about working in that factory setting, that they need to come into the factories.
There were persuasive efforts inside the factory walls as well, where internal posters constantly encouraged, instructed, and appealed to both men and women.
Within the Westinghouse Corporation, one image which has become widely known since the 1980s showed work as a strong but feminine woman in a red bandana, flexing her muscles under the word bubble, "We can do it." The poster by graphic artist and illustrator J. Howard Miller was designed to encourage production among female workers and may have been inspired by an earlier photograph of Naomi Parker.
Women who entered the workforce during World War II, whether single, married, black, white, urban, and rural, represented an exciting time of social change. For many, it was the first time that they'd ever earned a wage for their own labor. But all of them knew that they were indispensable to the war effort and that the fight for the four freedoms would have failed without their contributions.
This was an opportunity once and for all for these great virtues to be shared with the world. At the end of the war, America would be able to free all of these oppressed people from that were experiencing tyranny at that time. So this was really the feeling and the motivation. The Rosie the Riveters that I talked to and other people, well, they tell you that it was a time of great patriotism.
By the war's end, after the death of Franklin D. Roosevelt, President Harry Truman broke the news of the final victory in a radio address. It was clear that Womanpower had won the day.
From our war plants rolled the tanks and planes which blasted their way to the heart of our enemy. From our shipyards sprang the ships which bridged all the oceans of the world for our weapons and supplies. But back of it all were the will and spirit and determination of a free people who know what freedom is and who know that it is worth whatever price they had to pay to preserve it.